The morning Delia Sparks threaded her first needle for someone else's child, she told herself it was just one coat. It was September, cool enough that she could see her breath on the walk to the corner, and she had noticed the Heinz kids 3 days running in the same thin shirts, their skinny arms poking out below cuffs that stopped somewhere near their elbows. The twins were 7. They were not her children. She had enough to manage with Marcus, who was 9, and growing so fast she could barely keep his ankles covered. She had exactly $47 in her checking account, a sewing machine she had inherited from her grandmother, and a job at the laundromat on Clement Street that paid her $11.50 an hour. She told herself it was just one coat. She made 2. Then she made 3. By the end of that first week, she had stayed up past midnight 4 nights in a row. And by the end of that first September, she had sewn school clothes for 11 children on Breslin Avenue. She used fabric from the discount bins at the craft supply on 40th, remnants that cost her 80 cents a yard, and she cut patterns by hand from brown paper grocery bags. The children wore her work to school. Their mothers thanked her with sweet potato pies and grocery store flowers and promises to pay her back when things got better. She did not keep a ledger. She did not ask to be paid back. She had no idea that one of those mothers knew a woman who worked in the mayor's office. She had no idea that in 6 years the whole world would know her name. If you have ever done something quietly for someone who needed it, something you never put on a resume or posted to a page, drop a comment below. This story is for you. Stay with me. Delia had grown up on Breslin, in the third house from the end, the one with the green door that her father had painted when she was 4 and never repainted again, so that by the time she was a teenager it had faded to the colour of old mint. Her father had worked loading docks until his back gave out, and her mother had pressed other people's formal wear at a dry cleaning shop 2 bus rides away. They were people who knew the specific arithmetic of making do. They counted ounces of shampoo. They knew which grocery store marked down bread on Thursdays. They wore their coats until the lining tore. Then they wore them a little longer. What they had given Delia, along with the green door and the faded curtains and the sewing machine that lived in the corner of the kitchen, was the understanding that you did not let a neighbour's child go cold if you had thread and fabric and the hours. Her grandmother had taught her to sew on that machine when she was 8. By 12, she was hemming slacks for the women in the church basement. By 16, she was altering bridesmaid dresses for a neighbour's daughter whose mother could not afford a seamstress. She had a gift. She had never thought of it that way because in her family a gift was just a thing you had that you used for the people around you. It was not for sale. It was not for showing off. It was for the morning the Heinz twins showed up in thin shirts with their breath visible in the air. Delia was 31 years old in that first September. Marcus's father had been gone for 4 years, gone in the way that some men go, quietly and without warning, leaving a space that she had long since stopped waiting to see filled. She was not bitter about it. She was tired sometimes, and she missed what the marriage had promised to be, but she did not let the bitterness take root because she had watched bitterness take root in other people, and she had seen what it grew into. She had her mother nearby, who came on Tuesdays to watch Marcus while Delia worked the evening shift. She had her church, First Emmanuel on Wakefield, where she sang in the choir, and where Reverend Osei had once said from the pulpit that generosity was not what you had left over after your needs were met. It was the first thing you gave before you counted what was left. She had remembered that. It had settled somewhere deep. The laundromat job was 6 days a week, sometimes 7 when someone called out sick. She worked from 8 until 4, folding and sorting and running the big industrial machines, and she came home smelling faintly of warm cotton and detergent. And she cooked dinner for Marcus and checked his homework, and then, most nights, she sat at the sewing machine in the kitchen while he slept. She started keeping a notebook in the 2nd year. Not a ledger, not a record of debts, but a list of measurements. She would ask the mothers casually what sizes their children wore, and she would write it down in a spiral notebook with a blue cover, and she updated it as the children grew. She bought fabric at the end of each month, after rent and groceries and Marcus's school supplies, with whatever remained. Sometimes whatever remained was $11. Sometimes it was 25. She learned to stretch it. She learned which remnant bins had the best weights for children's clothes, the sturdier fabrics that could survive a school year of sliding and climbing, and the aggressive laundering that working mothers required. She favoured dark colours that hid stains. She reinforced every seam twice. In the 3rd year, other women on the block began helping her. Renee Okafor from the Yellow House brought her a bag of buttons she had been saving for years, sorted by size in little Ziploc bags. Carlotta Webb, whose own children were grown and out of the house, showed up one Saturday morning with a second sewing machine she had pulled out of storage and asked if Delia could use it. They set up both machines at the kitchen table and they worked side by side on Saturday afternoons, while Marcus played at a friend's house down the street and the radio played gospel. Carlotta was not a gifted seamstress, not in Delia's way, but she was steady and careful, and her seams were straight, and between them they could finish 2 or 3 garments in an afternoon. By then the notebook had 3 pages of measurements, and the clothes were going to children on 2 more streets, Monroe and Caldwell, where word had spread the way word spreads on a block where people know each other, through a conversation at the bus stop, through a mention at the school pickup. Delia did not advertise. She did not put up a sign. She just kept a list and kept sewing. In the 4th year, a woman named Patricia Voss moved into the apartment building on the corner of Breslin and Monroe. Patricia had 2 daughters, 6 and 8, and she had come from a complicated situation in another part of the city, and she was starting over with very little. She introduced herself to Delia at the school pickup one afternoon in late August, just before the new school year. Delia noticed the girls' shoes were too small, their feet slightly pinched in sandals they had grown past. She wrote down their names in the blue notebook that evening. Patricia Voss worked as an administrative assistant in the mayor's office. She did not mention this to Delia for almost a year. In the world Delia moved in, what a person did downtown was not usually the first or second thing you led with. You led with your children, and your block, and your church, and what you needed. Patricia was not the kind of person to wear her job as a credential. She was a woman starting over, grateful for a neighbour who had sewn her daughters a pair of jumpers before the first day of school without being asked, and without presenting a bill. They became friends the way women in proximity often do, slowly and without ceremony. They sat together at the school pickup. They shared coffee some Saturday mornings while Carlotta and Delia worked the machines and the girls played on the floor with scraps of fabric. Patricia learned to thread a needle that winter, and she was never much of a seamstress either, but she could cut patterns and she could press seams and she showed up, and showing up was the thing Delia had always valued most. They didn't have the kind of friendship where Patricia ever said, "I work in the mayor's office, you should let me tell someone about what you do here." Patricia understood, or seemed to understand, that Delia was not doing this for recognition. She was not building a profile. She was a woman with a sewing machine and a blue notebook and a clear sense of what her neighbourhood needed. The idea that someone should give her a plaque for it would have made her uncomfortable. It would have felt like being thanked for breathing. What Patricia did in the 5th year was mention it in passing. To a colleague named Sasha, who ran the mayor's community engagement office in the break room over coffee, the way you mention something that is simply true about the world you live in. She said, "I have a neighbour who has been sewing free school clothes for kids in my neighbourhood for 5 years. She said it the way she might say, 'The magnolias on my block are nice this year.' A simple fact. Something worth knowing." Sasha wrote it down. Delia did not know about Sasha. She did not know about the note Sasha had made in her own notebook, not a blue spiral one, but a city-issued planner, the kind with the municipal seal on the cover. She didn't know that Sasha had mentioned it to a deputy director named Franklin Webb, no relation to Carlotta, who had then mentioned it to the mayor's scheduler, who had flagged it as a possible community story for the mayor's annual Neighbourhood Dignity Recognition Programme, which the mayor had launched 2 years prior to bring attention to the quiet work being done by ordinary people in ordinary places. Delia knew none of this. She was in her 6th September, which had become the busiest month of the year, the month when the blue notebook filled with the most corrections as children grew over summer and the clothes from last year no longer fit. She and Carlotta had fallen into a rhythm as efficient as any small production. Delia cut and fitted. Carlotta pressed and finished. Renee Okafor, who had retired from her job at the hospital the previous spring, had become a 3rd pair of hands on Saturdays, and the 3 of them together could finish 5 or 6 garments in a long afternoon. They were sending clothes to 29 children across 4 streets, and this year Delia had quietly extended to a 5th street, Harden, after a teacher at Marcus's school had mentioned a family who had just arrived from another state with almost nothing. Marcus was 15 now. He helped load the washing machine when Delia pre-washed the new fabric before cutting. He had his grandmother's hands, long-fingered and careful, and once or twice he had sat beside Delia at the machine and let her guide his hands through a straight seam, though he had not taken to it the way she had. He had taken to numbers the way she had taken to thread, and he was in the advanced math track at his high school, and his teacher had told Delia at the fall conference that he had real gifts. Delia had thanked the teacher and thought about what her grandmother had said about gifts and what they were for. She was in the kitchen on a Thursday evening in late October, the blue notebook open beside the machine and 3 half-finished pairs of trousers for the Hardin Street family laid out on the table when Marcus called from the front window that there was a car outside. She didn't look up. Cars were always outside. He said it was a city car. She looked up then. She said she did not know why a city car would be on their street. He said there was someone getting out. She set down the trousers and went to the window, and she saw a man in a dark coat and a woman she recognized from the local news, and behind them, coming around the back of the vehicle, a figure she recognized immediately even in the dim light of the October evening, because his face had been on every bus shelter in the city for the past 3 years. Mayor Calvin Reese was standing on Breslin Avenue. Breslin. He was straightening his coat. He was looking at the house with the green door. Delia said, quietly, to no one in particular, "That cannot be right." Marcus said, "Mom, that's the mayor." She opened the door before he knocked. She had the presence of mind to do that at least, though she could not have told you afterward what she said in the first few seconds. She remembered the porch light was on and that she was wearing her sewing apron, and that Mayor Reese was a shorter man than he appeared on the news, and that he smiled when he saw her and said her name. He said, "Ms. Sparks, yeah, I hope we haven't come at a bad time." She said something to the effect that she was just sewing. He looked past her at the kitchen table, at the machines and the fabric and the blue notebook with its worn cover, and he nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to find. The woman with him, whose name was Sasha, introduced herself and shook Delia's hand, and then Deputy Director Franklin Webb, and then 3 other people from the mayor's community office whose names Delia absorbed and immediately forgot because her mind was doing something she could not quite control. She invited them in. She cleared the fabric from 2 chairs and offered coffee that she was embarrassed to discover she didn't have enough of. Carlotta Webb, who lived 2 houses away and had a habit of appearing when something significant was happening, materialized at the door within 10 minutes. Delia would ask her later how she knew, and Carlotta would say she had seen the city car. Mayor Reese sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the sewing machine. He looked at the blue notebook, not opening it, just looking at it. He said, "I've heard about this, and I wanted to come see for myself before I said anything publicly." He said, 6 years? She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "How many children?" She did not have to think about it. She said, 29 this year. Different from last year. They grow. He smiled at that. He said, "They do." He explained that the city had a program, the Neighborhood Dignity Fund, which provided grants to community-led initiatives that had been operating without institutional support. The grants were not enormous, but they were substantial. Substantial enough to mean something to a woman who had been buying remnants at 80 cents a yard. He said the nomination process was typically formal and documented, but that sometimes the mayor's office identified recipients through other channels and made the determination directly. He said they had identified her. He said the grant was $42,000. Delia heard the number. She sat with it for a moment without speaking. $42,000 was more money than she had ever held in her mind as something that could belong to her. She thought of the blue notebook. What of the blue? She thought of 6 Septembers of discount bins and reinforced seams and brown paper patterns and staying up past midnight. She thought of the Hines twins in thin shirts with their breath in the air. She said, "I don't know what to do with that." He said, "That's the right answer." There was a conversation after that, a longer one, in which Sasha explained the terms of the fund and the reporting requirements, which were modest, and in which Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Delia introduced him, and the mayor shook his hand and said something to him quietly that made him stand a little straighter. Carlotta made coffee from her own kitchen and brought it over, and no one said anything about the logistics of that. Renee Okafor appeared at some point too, because of course she did. Patricia Voss came last. She came through the back door the way she always did, as a neighbour, and not as a person from the mayor's office. And she sat down at the table, and she took Delia's hand, and she did not say, "I told them about you," because she had not told them in that way. She had mentioned it in passing. She had said a simple, true thing about the world she lived in, and she let the truth do what truth does when it finds people who are listening for it. Delia looked at her for a moment and did not say what she was feeling because she was not the kind of woman who always had to name a feeling. She squeezed her hand, and Patricia squeezed back, and that was enough. The mayor's visit was covered by 2 local news stations and a community newspaper. The coverage was respectful, not sensational. It focused on the number of children and the 6 years and the blue notebook and the 2 sewing machines in the kitchen. A photographer asked to photograph the machines, and Delia said yes, and she straightened the blue notebook on the table before he took the picture. And that image, the 2 machines and the worn notebook, ran in the community paper under the headline something about quiet work and loud love, though Delia had not read it in full because she had 3 pairs of trousers to finish for the Harden Street family. She finished them 2 days after the mayor's visit. She delivered them on a Saturday morning, folded and wrapped in brown paper the way she always delivered things. No bow, no card, just the clothes. The mother opened the door and Delia handed them over, and the mother said thank you and Delia said you're welcome. And that was that. The grant came through 6 weeks later. She deposited the cheque at the bank on 40th and stood at the counter for a moment afterward because her hands were shaking slightly and she needed a second to collect herself. The teller did not comment. Delia thanked her and walked out into the November morning and stood on the sidewalk and let the cold air settle her. She used some of the money to buy a used industrial-grade sewing machine that could handle heavier fabric without skipping stitches. She used some to buy fabric in quantity, bolts of good, durable cotton in the colours she knew from 6 years of notebooks, navy and forest green and burgundy and grey, the colours that lasted. She set aside a portion for the following September, when the children would have grown again and the measurements in the blue notebook would need correcting again. She used a small amount on Marcus, specifically for a graphing calculator his math teacher had mentioned, and for new shoes, his first new shoes from a retail store in 2 years. She kept sewing. She kept the same hours, more or less, because the work was the same work. More fabric meant more to cut and fit, not fewer nights at the machine. The number of children grew because the news coverage had brought her families from a 6th Street and then a 7th. And she and Carlotta and Renee sat down in early December and made a plan for how to manage it, who would coordinate measurements, who would handle cutting, how to sequence the work across the year so that September didn't become impossible. It was the first time any of them had sat down and made a plan, because before the grant they had simply done what the week allowed and hoped it was enough. Now they could think ahead. Marcus sat with them at that planning meeting, uninvited and unremarkable about it, as if it had simply not occurred to him that he might not belong there. He had brought a yellow legal pad, and he was writing things down. When Carlotta said she wasn't sure how they would track orders for 7 streets, Marcus said, without looking up, "I can build a spreadsheet for that." The 3 women looked at each other. Delia looked at her son for a moment with something she could not quite name, something between pride and recognition, and the particular tenderness that comes from watching a child become who they are going to be. She said, "That would help." He said, "I'll have it ready by Thursday." He had it ready by Tuesday. The following September was the most organised the project had ever been. Marcus's spreadsheet tracked measurements, fabric requirements and delivery dates, and it updated automatically when children grew and numbers changed. They completed clothes for 37 children that fall, their largest number. Delia had added 2 more volunteer seamstresses from the church, women who had heard about the work from Reverend Osei and wanted to be part of it. The kitchen on Thursday nights had become something closer to a workshop than a kitchen. Machines running and fabric moving and the radio on, and Marcus doing homework at the end of the table with his headphones in, and Delia moving between the machines with her scissors and her quiet authority. A woman from the city's Workforce Development Office came in November to ask if Delia had ever considered teaching sewing formally. Delia said she had not. The woman left a card. Delia put the card in the drawer where she kept things to think about later. She thought about it for 3 months. In February, she called the number. She spoke to the Workforce Development Officer for 20 minutes, and she asked questions, and she listened carefully to the answers, and she said she would need to think about it some more. She hung up and looked at the blue notebook on the counter, and she thought about her grandmother's kitchen and the machine in the corner, and what it meant to have a skill and know what it was for. She called back in March. She said yes. The sewing class was held on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of every month in the community room at the church. 6 students the first session, 8 the second, 11 by the spring. 3 of her students were women who had never touched a sewing machine. 2 were teenage girls from Breslin and Monroe who Delia had known since they were small enough to be measured for jumpers. 1 was a 57-year-old man named Gerald, who said he had always wanted to learn and had simply never had the occasion. He turned out to have a gift for it. By the third session, he was finishing seams faster than anyone else in the room. She told Gerald he had a gift. He said he didn't know about that. She said, "Your grandmother would know." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, and she laughed too, and the room felt good, the way a room feels when something real has been said in it, and everyone present understood. The mayor came back in June, unannounced except for the city car, though by then Carlotta had learned to watch for city cars and had texted Delia 2 minutes before the knock. He came to see the class. He sat in the back row and watched for 40 minutes without saying much. When it was over, he shook Gerald's hand, and Gerald showed him the seam he had just finished, and the mayor looked at it with what appeared to be genuine interest and said it was very good. Outside on the church steps, he said to Delia, "This is bigger than the neighbourhood." She said, "It's always been bigger than the neighbourhood. It just started here." He said he would like to talk about expansion funding, about what it would take to replicate the model in other parts of the city, whether Delia would be willing to be involved in that conversation. She said she would be willing to think about it. She said, "But Breslin comes first." He said, "Of course." She said, "I'm not interested in leaving what I started." He said, "I know. That's why we're asking you and not someone else." She stood on the church steps in the June warmth and considered this. A city car at the curb. The sound of the last students leaving through the side door. Somewhere inside, Carlotta was folding fabric and Renee was closing up the extra machine. Marcus was down the block at a friend's house, and tomorrow she would check his homework, and the day after that she would start on the fall measurements because September had a way of arriving faster than you expected. $42,000 and a city grant and a class at the church and the mayor on her steps. And still, always the blue notebook. She said, "I'll call your office on Monday." He said, "We'll be ready." She went back inside and helped Carlotta fold the fabric, and they did not talk very much because they did not need to. The machine was cool now. The room smelled like clean cotton and the faint particular warmth of a space where people had been working. Delia picked up a half-finished seam someone had left on the table and looked at it, noting where the tension had gone slightly loose, thinking about how to show it at the next session. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the green door. She thought of the Hines twins in thin shirts 6 years ago and a whole lifetime back. Some things you start without knowing where they go. You start because a child is cold and you have thread and hours. You start because your grandmother showed you something and you understood it was not for keeping. You stay because staying is who you are, and the staying is the thing that finally, one October evening, brings a knock at your door. She set the seam down. She would fix it Tuesday. Did someone give you something quietly, a skill, a coat, a little of their time that came back to you later in ways they could not have planned? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to hear about another woman who gave what she had without counting the cost, the next story is right here waiting for you. This is a work of fiction inspired by the kinds of ordinary, deeply good people who live on blocks just like Breslin Avenue. All characters, events, and places are invented. In the years that followed, the blue notebook became 2 blue notebooks, then a third. She kept all of them in the kitchen drawer beside the machine, layered flat, the oldest on the bottom. Occasionally she would pull one out and page through it for a measurement she half remembered or a name she was trying to place, and she would see the handwriting from years ago, slightly rounder and more careful than her handwriting now, as if she had been writing for an audience back then, before she understood she was only writing for herself. The measurements of children who were now teenagers, names whose owners she still saw at the bus stop or the school pickup, taller every time, the remembered dimensions of their 7-year-old bodies, a private knowledge she carried. She did not think of this as nostalgia. She thought of it as inventory. The expansion conversation with the mayor's office took most of the following year, and it was slower and more complicated than she had expected, because city things always were. There were meetings with people who used words she had to look up later, and there were committees and subcommittees and a pilot program proposal that was revised 4 times before anyone was satisfied with it. Delia sat through all of it. She asked questions when she didn't understand something, and she was patient when patience was required, and firm when firmness was required, and she discovered that she was harder to ignore than she had expected, that a woman who had been sewing in her kitchen for 6 years without asking permission had a particular kind of stillness in a meeting room that other people noticed. The pilot program launched 18 months after the mayor's first visit. It was called the Neighborhood Stitch Initiative, which was not a name she had chosen, but which she could live with. It placed trained volunteer seamstresses in 3 additional neighbourhoods, women who had trained with Delia and who had demonstrated the commitment and the specific organisational patience the work required. Each was given access to the spreadsheet Marcus had built, which by now he had upgraded twice, and which tracked measurements and fabric needs and delivery windows with the quiet efficiency of something designed by a person who genuinely understood the problem. Marcus was 17 by then and had begun receiving letters from universities. 3 of them arrived in a single week in December, and he laid them on the kitchen table beside the sewing machine, and Delia made dinner while he opened them, and when he looked up she was watching him and she did not try to disguise it. He got into all 3. The one he chose was 300 miles away, and his departure the following August was the first time Delia had ever stood in the Breslin Avenue house alone and felt the particular weight of a room where someone used to be. She had known this moment was coming, in the way you know something for years before you feel it. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time that first evening, and then she sat down at the machine and threaded the needle and started on a pair of trousers for one of the Harden Street children who had grown over the summer. Her hands on the fabric were steady. Her hands had always been steady. She thought, he is doing what gifts are for. The same as I am. The same as my grandmother was. She did not need to say it aloud. The church class expanded too, eventually taking over the whole fellowship hall on Tuesdays rather than just the community room, because 11 students had become 22 and then 31, and the waiting list Carlotta maintained had people on it who had been waiting 4 months for a spot. Gerald, the 57-year-old man who had turned out to have a gift, was now co-teaching the second session each month, his big hands moving through the technical corrections with a patience and care that Delia recognised as the particular quality of someone who had always wanted to be good at a thing and was finally being given the chance. She had told him once that his seams were better than hers now. He said that wasn't possible. She said, "Look at the seam." He looked. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "I told you." He said he didn't know about that. She said what her grandmother would have said, "You never need to know about it. You just need to keep going." On the second anniversary of the mayor's visit, Patricia Voss came over on a Thursday evening and sat at the kitchen table and had coffee. And they did not talk much about the years between then and now, because those years were simply the life they had both lived, and they didn't need to narrate it to each other. Patricia's daughters were in middle school. The older one had asked Delia to teach her to sew, and Delia was teaching her on Sunday afternoons, the same way her grandmother had taught her, patiently and without ceremony and from the beginning. Renee Okafor's retirement had turned out to be exactly the kind of retirement where a person is no longer employed, but is no more at rest than she ever was. She organised the fabric orders now and managed relationships with 3 suppliers who had learned over time that Delia's volume and consistency made her a worthwhile customer, and who had begun offering her prices that bore almost no resemblance to the 80 cents a yard discount bin of the early years. Renee tracked this with a satisfaction she did not try to hide. She had a gift for negotiation that nobody on Breslin had known about until she retired. Carlotta's second sewing machine had long since been joined by a third, and the kitchen was full in the way a space is full when it is genuinely used. Every surface doing something. Every drawer containing something useful. The green door had been repainted the previous spring, not because it needed to be strictly speaking, but because Marcus had come home for the summer and had said it was time, and the 2 of them had spent a Saturday morning doing it together. They chose the same colour, or as close as the hardware store could match it. Delia had stood back afterward and looked at it and thought about her father, who had painted the door when she was 4 and never repainted it again. She thought about all the years the old paint had held. She thought, some things you start without knowing they're going to last. You just do them because they need doing, and they last because they were done right. The door lasted 30 years. The blue notebook had lasted 6 and then 6 more and was on its way to more than that. The seams she reinforced twice would outlast the garments by years. That was not an accident. That was a choice made in the dark of the kitchen at midnight when nobody was watching. Nobody ever needed to watch. The work was the work whether it was witnessed or not. She had known that from the beginning. The beginning with the Hines twins and the thin shirts and the breath visible in the September air. She just had not known, in that beginning, that the world would eventually find its way to her door. She would find out, and she would stand at the door in her sewing apron and let it in, and she would not change what she had always done, because it had never needed to change. It had only needed to continue. The blue notebook on the counter, the machine in the corner, the children on the block growing. She kept going. There is a particular quality to the work that you do in a kitchen at midnight when a child is asleep down the hall and the rest of the block has gone quiet. The quality is not urgency, because urgency belongs to emergencies, and this was never an emergency. It was a choice made again every night to sit down and pick up the fabric and put the needle through. Urgency is loud. This was quiet. It had the quality of something that could be sustained, that was meant to be sustained, that would go on being true whether anyone noticed or not. Delia had noticed other things in those kitchen hours that she would not have noticed otherwise. She noticed the specific sounds of the house settling at night, the way the old pipes spoke to each other in the walls. She noticed the changing quality of the outside darkness across the seasons, the way September dark was different from December dark, less settled somehow, still carrying the temperature of summer in its edges. She noticed that her hands worked differently in different moods, faster and slightly looser when she was anxious about something, steadier and more deliberate when she was at peace, and she had learned over the years to use the needlework as a kind of reading of herself, a way of knowing how she actually felt underneath whatever she was telling herself about how she felt. She had been at peace more often than not. This surprised her sometimes, given the circumstances of her life as she would have described them to a stranger. A woman alone, not much money, long hours, a job that did not ask much of her mind. She should have been, according to some accounting she did not entirely believe in, less at peace. But the kitchen at midnight was hers in a way the rest of her hours were not always hers, and the work she was doing was chosen and purposeful, and there is a specific kind of peace available in work that is chosen and purposeful that cannot be purchased with circumstances. She did not think of this in these terms. She would not have said any of it this way. But she felt it in the hum of the machine and the resistance of good fabric under her hands and the stack of finished garments at the end of the table that had not been there 3 hours before. Carlotta felt it too, she knew. They had never talked about it exactly, because neither of them was the kind of woman who talked about things exactly, but they had sat together at the machines on enough Saturday afternoons that the unspoken thing between them was as clear as any conversation. Renee felt it too, Delia suspected, though Renee expressed it differently, in the precision of her fabric orders and the small, quiet satisfaction she took in a good price. Negotiated, the particular pleasure of a person whose skills were finally being fully used. The morning after the mayor's second visit, the one in June on the church steps, Delia had gotten up before 5 and sat at the kitchen machine in the dark before the light came and the day got organised around her. She had not been able to sleep, not from anxiety, but from a kind of wakefulness she recognised from a handful of other mornings in her life. The morning after Marcus was born, the morning after she had understood her marriage was over, the morning after her grandmother died. Mornings when the world had shifted enough that the old sleep did not fit anymore, and a new one had not yet settled in. She had not sewn anything that morning. She had sat at the machine without threading it, and held the blue notebook in her lap and looked at the walls of the kitchen, the tiles her mother had helped her clean when she first moved back into the house after her father died, and left it to her. The same tiles, the same drawer where she kept things to think about later, the same window that showed the dark of Brazelin Avenue, the street light at the corner, the early cars beginning to move. She had thought about the $42,000 and what it meant and what it did not mean. It meant she could buy fabric in quantity and stop counting yards so carefully. It meant she could stop supplementing the work by skipping her own lunch. It did not mean the work was different. The work was the same work. Children grew and needed clothes, and September came around again, and the blue notebook needed updating, and the machines needed to be running. The money was a relief. It was not a change. She had thought about expansion and what it might mean and what she was afraid it might mean, which was that the things she had made in her kitchen would become something she did not recognize, administered by people who had not been in it from the beginning, and who would bring the particular fluorescent logic of institution to something that had thrived in the particular warmth of kitchens and church fellowship halls and Saturday afternoons with the radio on. She had decided, sitting in the dark with the untreaded machine, that she would go to those meetings and she would be present in them in the way she was present at the machine, with her full attention and her full self and her specific knowledge of what worked and what didn't, and she would make sure that the thing that spread from Breslin Avenue carried the essential quality of what had happened here, which was not a program but a practice, not a service but a commitment, not a model but a way of being. And if at some point it became something she no longer recognised, she would leave that part to the people in the offices and come home and sit at her machine and keep sewing, because the children on Breslin Avenue would still need clothes in September, regardless of what happened in any meeting room downtown. The light came up around 5:30 and she made coffee and threaded the machine and finished the trousers she had started the night before, and then made breakfast and went to work at the laundromat, where she folded other people's clothes for 8 hours and came home smelling like warm cotton. She still worked at the laundromat. She had raised the question with herself after the grant of whether to leave. She had decided to stay. The work there was honest and she was good at it, and the people she worked with had been her colleagues for 6 years, and she was not a person who left things because something better had appeared. She was a person who stayed. She stayed at the laundromat. She stayed at the machine in the kitchen. She stayed on Breslin Avenue, in the house her father had painted green when she was 4. The green door repainted once now, and no doubt to be repainted again when the current coat wore through. She stayed because staying was the whole thing. Staying when it was inconvenient, and when the account balance was frightening, and when the hours were too long, and when nobody was watching. Staying was the virtue and the practice and the engine. Everything that had followed, the grant, the mayor, the pilot program, the class, the second and third machines, Marcus's yellow legal pad and his spreadsheet and his letters from universities, all of it had followed from staying. She had not planned any of it. She had just kept going. She thought of the Hines twins sometimes, wondered where they were now. They would be teenagers, 13 or so, already past the age when their mother would be asking Delia for school clothes. She saw the family occasionally, at the store, at the school pickup back when she still had a child at the school. The twins were tall and healthy looking. She did not know if they knew who had made their coats in September of the first year. She did not need them to know. The knowing was not the point. The coats were the point. She kept the blue notebook in the kitchen drawer beside the machine. She was on her third one now, the first 2 below it layered flat. She kept going.